So we want to talk a little bit about now the three acts of the telephone call. I introduced them earlier, but I'd like to get into a little bit more detail now. Um, the three acts of the telephone call are if you like it, I call them acts, very much the way that somebody might refer to a play or a movie. A typical movie or theatrical structure is laid out in three acts. The first act is typically where you get to know who the characters in the movie are or the play. The characters are introduced typically in the in the first act. They get on stage, and then you understand who they are. In the second act, usually what happens is you get an exchange between the different characters. That's where the action happens. Usually there's some degree of tension, something to be overcome, questions that are asked, answers that are given. And then finally, we get to the third act where we resolve all of the tension and the challenges that might have occurred in the second act. And that third act is really the closing act, where it's understood what happens to these characters and how things end for them. Now, I like this approach because it's very clear in terms of three-act structure. It also is very similar to the way newsreaders approach the news. First, a newsreader might say to you, first I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you. Then they might tell you. And then at the end, they might say, here's what I told you. And again, that three-act structure is very, very clear and easy to remember. Now, when it comes to the telephone call, it's very similar. Act 1 is all about greeting. So it's all about reducing tension, creating rapport with somebody, introducing each other, knowing who is on stage. I also like the theatrical analogy to think about this in the sense that when you're on the phone or when you're in front of somebody in a sales environment, you really are effectively on stage. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have your lines prepared or you need to deliver some kind of script. I'd want you to put that out of your mind. I'm not going to be suggesting scripts to you. I will be asking you to think about certain things and memorize them ahead of time so that you can always say a very similar thing later on. But it's not so much about reciting canned lines. I find that that approach tends to reduce the level of spontaneity that might arise and the level of comfort and rapport that might be established between the caller and yourself. So the first step is Act 1, and that's where we're doing a lot of the greeting, and we're trying to understand who they are. We're getting that lead information, that minimum data set that I talked about. And then we're asking them for permission to get to Act 2. And Act 2 is, I call it, the opening. And if you think about it almost figuratively, what we're doing is we're taking a lead and we're opening up that lead. We're aiming to understand what's inside that person. What are their motivations? What kind of criteria do they have for making a decision? What types of priorities do they have? What are their past experiences? What are they hoping to achieve? That's what the opening's about. And we need to open up that lead before we can close that lead, if that makes sense. And that is the third act. The third act is closing. What that means is essentially resolving all the tension, getting all the answers answered, having all the questions explored. And once we know what we have, then we're able to close that lead and identify what's going to happen at the end. This is where we make a recommendation and we say, for example, well, listen, what I recommend is that you come in on this date or that date at that time or this time. And when you come in, this is what we're going to be doing. This is what's involved. How does that sound to you? And then we're able to actually lead the lead essentially through the whole process from start to finish. After that, and only after closing, is when I suggest handling objections. We're not going to get into handling objections too much. I have a whole course on handling objections that I either deliver live or in a video setting like this. But handling objections is something that I will say that you only really address after you've made your proposal. So after you've invited the lead to come in for a consultation, only if they say no or they want to think about it is when you're actually going to be handling any kind of objection. There's no sense in having debates with people on the phone before you know whether or not you want to invite them. And I think that's a critical distinction that needs to be made right from the onset. You're in control of this phone call. This is your call. They're calling you, right? I mean, we're really, really not in a situation where you're phoning somebody out of the blue, interrupting them during dinner, and offering your services without them ever saying that they were interested. They're interested. They found you on your website. They found you on an advertisement. They called you. So they're interested. And it's important for us to understand that there's a balancing effect here, that if we take control of that call, and we don't necessarily feel like we have to give everybody an appointment, we select people to invite them to appointments. It changes the playing field entirely, because it reduces the notion that you're actually subservient to the caller, and establishes more of a level playing field, which gives you a lot more confidence, and which gives actually the caller a lot more confidence, because they feel that they can follow you. Nobody wants to follow a follower. They want to follow a leader. And you need to establish leadership on that phone call. And you do it by having a process. You do it by knowing your roadmap. You do it by knowing what it is that you're going to do next. And you do it with a degree of confidence and effectiveness of delivery, so that you can lead the patient through these acts. Finally, if the patient does not book, then we can discuss follow-up, calling them back if they agree to that, or they might call us, and we need to be able to handle their objections when they call us, or simply book them in. So those are essentially the 3 acts of the phone call. Again, I'll reiterate them. There's Act 1, which is greeting, Act 2, which is opening, Act 3, which is closing. And in that, once that's done, then we can get into handling objections and follow-up.